A waitress kisses a billionaire in front of his fiancée at the airport. When he finds out why, he's scared. Isabella hurried through the bustling restaurant of Los Angeles International Airport, her light blue uniform clinging to her body, slightly wrinkled from the frenzied pace of her shift. Her hair was hastily tied in a messy bun, a sign of the long hours and few hours of sleep that had accumulated over the past weeks. But none of it mattered. Nothing around her held meaning other than the crumpled piece of paper clutched tightly in her hand. Her eyes scanned the words written there, fearing they would somehow disappear before she could do what she needed. Her heart raced. Isabella knew she had only a few minutes before it was too late. The airport was packed, with announcements echoing over the loudspeakers and a crowd of passengers rushing about. The sound of suitcase wheels against the shiny floor blended with the hum of conversations and the constant buzz of the international terminal. But for her, it all felt distant. Her focus was only on one specific point ahead, the VIP area, where Matthew Miller was surrounded by his family and security team. Matthew radiated power and sophistication. His perfectly tailored dark grey suit, a tie aligned without a single crease, and his hair impeccably slicked back. Every detail of him screamed success. The man who had once been on the edge of collapse was now one of the most influential figures in the business world. Beside him stood his wife, Emily, always elegant, holding a coffee cup while speaking with Jacob, Matthew's older brother. The couple's children, James and Mary, were absorbed in their phones, oblivious to the business discussions and travel details taking place. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. Her body protested against what she was about to do. Everything screamed that it was madness, that she'd be thrown out before even speaking a word. But there was no choice now. She needed to be heard. She needed Matthew to know. Before she could hesitate, she took firm steps toward them. Matthew's bodyguards, trained to react to any unexpected approach, began to move, but Isabella was faster. In an impulsive and desperate gesture, she cupped Matthew's face in her hands and kissed him. Time stood still. The brief touch of her lips against his lasted only a moment, but it was enough to freeze the entire surrounding environment. Shock passed over Matthew's expression, his wide eyes reflecting surprise and confusion. The murmurs of the crowd began to grow, spreading like wildfire among the onlookers. Emily dropped her coffee cup, the hot liquid spilling across the floor without her noticing. Her face twisted in indignation before her voice sliced through the silence. "What the hell is going on here?" Jacob was already holding up his phone, ready to call airport security. The bodyguards rushed to pull Isabella away from Matthew, gripping her arms tightly. She struggled to keep her stance, refusing to divert her gaze from the man in front of her. Matthew's children, startled, exchanged confused glances, trying to figure out if this was some sort of prank or if they were actually witnessing something unbelievable. "Who is this woman?" Emily demanded, her voice thick with fury and humiliation. But Matthew, unlike everyone else, did not react with anger. His breath was still ragged from the impact of the situation, and his mind raced to process what had just happened. He focused on Isabella's eyes, searching for answers before his gaze fell to her trembling hands. That was when he saw the crumpled paper. Matthew's expression changed. Surprise shifted to recognition. He knew exactly what that piece of paper was. "Wait, I know her." His firm voice halted all movement around them. The bodyguards hesitated, still holding Isabella, but now with less conviction. Emily looked at her husband, confused and angrier than ever. "What? How do you know her?" Isabella swallowed hard, feeling the grip on her loosen. Her heart still pounded, but for the first time that night a glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes. Matthew extended his hand, taking the paper from her trembling fingers. He unfolded it slowly, as though he needed to see it with his own eyes to believe that this fragment of his past had returned to haunt him. Isabella didn't look away, knowing this would be her only chance. Matthew read the words written there, and a shiver ran down his spine. Everything around him disappeared for a moment. The airport, the crowd, his family. Nothing existed except that memory resurfacing. The paper, stained by time and wrinkled by desperation, carried a truth he had never forgotten. Emily stepped forward, trying to see what was written. "Matthew, what is happening?" But he didn't respond immediately. He simply lifted his gaze, staring at Isabella with a mix of disbelief and something that seemed a lot like gratitude. Isabella took a deep breath before finally speaking. "I had to do this so you would listen to me." Matthew clenched the paper in his hands, feeling the weight of the past pulling him back. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew nothing would be the same again. The atmosphere in the VIP room of Los Angeles International Airport contrasted sharply with the tension hanging in the air. The large glass windows revealed the constant movement of passengers outside, but inside, everything seemed stagnant. The luxury of the space, pristine leather armchairs, soft lighting, and the faint aroma of imported coffee made Isabella feel completely out of place. The air conditioning kept the temperature pleasant, but a strange chill ran down her spine. Matthew Miller sat in silence, elbows resting on his knees, his forehead furrowed. The crumpled paper was still in his hands, his eyes scanning the words over and over, as though rereading them might change the meaning of what was written. Emily could not contain her indignation. She paced back and forth, the sound of her high heels echoing against the glossy floor. The fury in her eyes was about to explode, and her quickened breath betrayed her struggle to stay composed. "I demand an explanation," she finally said, breaking the silence with a voice sharp as a blade. Jacob, who had stayed near the door, merely crossed his arms, analyzing the scene with a serious and distrustful expression. He observed Isabella as if trying to decipher an enigma that made no sense. "Matthew," Emily insisted, impatient, "who is this woman, and why is she acting like she has some right over you?" Isabella felt the weight of everyone's gaze upon her. Her heart raced, but she kept her posture strong. She wouldn't back down now. Matthew took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a brief moment before facing her. "Emily, there are things about me that you don't know." His wife crossed her arms, her face a mixture of rage and disbelief. "Things about you," she scoffed, a cold and humorless laugh escaping her. "Like the fact that this waitress says she saved your life." Isabella held Matthew's gaze, waiting for him to speak. She knew it wasn't her place to explain. He ran his hands over his face, as though trying to gather the courage to continue. "It was many years ago," he began in a low voice, almost a whisper. "I wasn't the man I am today." Emily narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" Matthew leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. His chest rose and fell in a controlled rhythm, but Isabella noticed the restless gleam in his eyes. "It was a rainy night," he continued. "I was destroyed." No one interrupted. "My world was collapsing. I had lost everything, businesses, money, credibility. The Matthew Miller you know didn't exist back then. There was only a desperate man with no way out." Isabella averted her eyes to the floor. Even after so much time, it was hard to remember that night. "I entered the restaurant here at the airport," Matthew went on. "I was soaked. I ordered a coffee. Not because I wanted to drink it, but because I needed one last moment to think." Jacob furrowed his brow, discomfort evident. "A last moment?" Matthew sighed. "Yes, I was determined to give up on everything." The room fell silent once more. Emily blinked, trying to process the information. "You were—" Matthew nodded subtly. Her eyes filled with something like shock and pain. "I didn't know that." Her voice was quieter now. Matthew ran his fingers over the crumpled paper. "Because I never told you." He looked at Isabella, and she held his gaze. But someone noticed. Emily turned her gaze back to Isabella, and this time there was less hostility in her expression. "I was clearing tables at the restaurant that night," Isabella finally spoke. Her voice didn't tremble. "I found the note." "The note?" Jacob asked. "My farewell note," Matthew replied. Emily covered her mouth with her hand, as if the shock hit her again. "When I saw that note," Isabella continued, "I knew what it meant. My father wrote one just like it before he took his own life. I knew that empty look Matthew had when he left." Emily's breath faltered. "And what did you do?" Isabella shifted her gaze to Matthew before responding. "I ran after him." Jacob uncrossed his arms and leaned slightly forward, intrigued by her answer. "You ran after him?" "Yes. It was raining, and he was already outside. But I couldn't let him go without trying something." Matthew gave a small, humorless smile. "And then she shouted." Isabella swallowed before repeating the words. "Don't go. You need to try my grandmother's hot chocolate first." Emily blinked a few times. "What?" Matthew let out a short laugh, devoid of emotion. "It sounds silly, but it was enough to make me stop." "And I needed him to stop," Isabella said. "I needed to find something that would make him hesitate, even if only for a second." Matthew ran his hand through his hair. "And she did." Emily looked at Isabella for a long moment, then at her husband. The discomfort was clear on her face. "I had no idea." Jacob, who had been silent up until now, slowly shook his head. "This is a lot." Matthew nodded. "Yes." Emily took a deep breath, composing herself. Her gaze hardened again. "All right, you saved Matthew that night, but why now? Why did you reappear after so many years?" Isabella held her breath for a moment before speaking. "Because now, I need to be saved. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it. So I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel." The rain continued to pour outside, streaming down the fogged windows of the small restaurant at the airport. The sound of the droplets hitting the metal roof was the only thing that broke the uncomfortable silence between Matthew and Isabella. The warm coffee cups sat before them forgotten, cooling down little by little, as though they reflected Matthew's hesitation to accept what had just happened. He was still trying to process how a stranger, a waitress, had intervened so abruptly in his decision to disappear that night. Sitting across from her, Matthew felt exposed, vulnerable. He was a man used to hiding his emotions, to concealing his failures behind a firm, controlled expression, but there was something in Isabella's gaze that completely disarmed him. It wasn't pity, nor was it forced compassion. It was something different. "Why?" He finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse, laden with exhaustion. "Why did you care?" Isabella didn't look away. On the contrary, she held his gaze firmly, as though she wanted him to understand something much deeper than just her words. "Because I've seen that look before," she said softly. Matthew furrowed his brow. "What?" She took a deep breath, lowering her eyes for a moment before glancing back at the cold coffee in front of her. "My father." The simple mention of the name made Matthew's chest tighten. Isabella stirred the spoon in her cup lightly, as if she were trying to find the courage to continue. "He was a good man, hard-working, dedicated. But life doesn't always care about being fair, does it?" Matthew didn't respond. He simply watched as Isabella tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and continued speaking. "One day, he broke. He didn't have the strength to keep going. And I saw that same look in his eyes the last time I saw him." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Matthew felt something shift inside him. "I saw the same look in you today," Isabella finished. Matthew shifted his gaze out the window. The rain fell relentlessly, as if trying to wash away everything that had happened up until now. "I failed," he said, his voice heavy with a pain he had never dared to admit before. "I worked my whole life to build something, and I lost everything." Isabella nodded slightly, her expression unchanged. "I thought I was invincible, that nothing could bring me down. But one mistake, just one mistake, and everything came crashing down. I became a failure." He laughed bitterly, but Isabella didn't smile. "Do you think failure is the end?" Matthew turned to look at her. What else could it be? She interlaced her fingers on the table, deep in thought. "I used to think the end was when we stopped trying. My father stopped." "But you don't have to stop." Matthew laughed again, this time with less bitterness. "And what do you suggest? That I order another coffee and pretend everything will be better tomorrow?" Isabella shook her head, a small smile appearing on her lips. "No. I suggest that you fight for one more day. Just one." Matthew raised an eyebrow. "And then?" She shrugged. "Then you decide if you want to try another." He fell silent, absorbing her words. No matter how simple they were, there was something in them, something he couldn't ignore. The night passed, and they spoke for hours. Isabella shared stories of her life, of the small house she lived in with her mother, of the financial struggles, and how, despite everything, she always believed that each new day could bring something different. Matthew, in turn, spoke of the mistakes that led him to this point, the betrayals he'd suffered in the business world, the crushing weight of the expectations he could never meet. And then, somewhere in the early hours of the morning, they made a pact. "Just one more day," Matthew repeated, almost as if testing the words in his mouth. Isabella smiled. "Just one." And that's what happened. One day turned into a week, then a month. With Isabella's help, Matthew secured a temporary job at the restaurant. It wasn't much, but it was something. He washed dishes, cleaned tables, served customers. In the beginning, he felt humiliated. A man who once negotiated millions, now holding a tray. But little by little, he realized that it didn't define him. Over time, he found new opportunities. His sharp business mind quickly started to rebuild, and years later, he had become an empire. But Isabella, she disappeared. One morning, when he returned to the restaurant to thank her, she was gone. None of the staff knew where she had gone. No one had any clues, no messages, just an empty space. Fate had separated them. Until that day, at the airport. Matthew blinked, snapping back to the present. The silence in the VIP room was still heavy. He looked at Isabella, now so different from the girl he had met years ago, and finally asked, "Why now?" She took a deep breath before answering. "Because now I need you." The truth hit Matthew like a punch. "What?" "I'm sick, Matthew," she confessed. "The same illness that took my mother." The ground seemed to fall from beneath him. "Isabella," she gave a small, sad smile. "I knew I couldn't afford the treatment on my own. I knew I had to find you, but after all this time, I didn't know if you'd listen to me." Matthew felt a knot tighten in his throat. "So, the kiss?" She nodded. "It was my last option." He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. Fate had torn them apart, but now, somehow, it had brought them back together. The impact of Isabella's words still reverberated through the VIP room. Matthew felt the weight of the revelation crushing his chest, a dull ache that clouded his ability to think clearly. His mind tried to process everything all at once, the reunion, the illness, the desperation hidden in her eyes. But above all, there was the undeniable certainty that he couldn't let this story end like this. In an almost instinctive movement, Matthew dropped to his knee in front of Isabella. The young woman's eyes widened in surprise, and she tried to protest, but he held her hands in his, ignoring the shocked gaze of Emily and Jacob. "It's my turn now," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. "I will give you all the days you need to fight." Isabella's throat tightened. She had never imagined that Matthew, the man she once saved from the brink of oblivion, would kneel before her with such intensity. There was sincerity in his gaze, a promise that could not be broken. "Matthew," she whispered, unsure of how to respond. "I won't accept this," he continued, squeezing her hands just a little tighter. "I won't accept finding you only to lose you." The silence in the room grew heavier. Emily turned her gaze away, uncomfortable with the scene. But the discomfort she felt wasn't just because of the situation. It was something deeper. She saw, at that moment, that Isabella wasn't a threat to her marriage, nor was she some lost piece from Matthew's past. Isabella was part of something bigger, something that went beyond any relationship. With a long sigh, Emily moved closer and, to everyone's surprise, placed her hand gently on Isabella's shoulder. "You won't be alone," she said quietly, her voice almost reluctant but genuine. Isabella's eyes widened, a tear threatening to escape. She had never expected this, never imagined that Emily, the woman she had viewed as an obstacle, would offer such an unexpected act of solidarity. The words, though soft, were a bridge. It was the first sign of something human between them. The warmth in Isabella's chest grew, but it was mixed with a sadness she couldn't shake. She tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Jacob, who had been silent until then, let out a heavy breath and picked up his phone. His expression had shifted from skepticism to resolution. Without a second thought, he began dialing numbers, speaking in low tones. "What are you doing?" Emily asked, frowning. Jacob barely glanced at her, his voice steady. "Finding specialists." Matthew nodded, a look of gratitude in his eyes. He knew that when Jacob took charge, it was never half-hearted. His brother was practical, and in this moment, his cold efficiency was exactly what they needed. As Jacob spoke on the phone, the door to the VIP room swung open suddenly. Matthew's children, James and Mary, entered, running into the room. "Dad, why are we taking so long?" Mary asked, holding her phone in her hand. The moment she saw Isabella sitting with red-rimmed eyes, her playful tone shifted. James, slightly older, stopped and took in the strange atmosphere. His brow furrowed. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Matthew hesitated for a moment, but Isabella, in an instinctive gesture, forced a weak smile and answered, "My name is Isabella." Mary looked between her father, Emily, and Jacob, as if trying to determine whether this woman was a friend or a stranger. Then, without warning, she rushed over to Isabella and wrapped her arms around her. "You look sad," the girl said, in a simplicity only children possess. Isabella froze for a moment, unsure of how to react, but then something inside her broke. She enveloped Mary in her arms, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the embrace seep into her heart. James hesitated, but after a beat, he walked over and placed a gentle hand on Isabella's shoulder, as though silently letting her know he was there. Emily, observing the scene from a distance, couldn't help but be surprised. Her children, who were usually distant from strangers, were clearly responding to something deeper, to an invisible connection they felt with Isabella. It was as though they sensed her need for comfort more than her circumstances. Matthew inhaled deeply, his resolve already forming in his heart. "You're staying with us," he said suddenly, looking straight at Isabella. She lifted her gaze, confused. "What?" "You're coming to my house," he repeated. "You'll receive the best treatment possible. I won't accept anything less." Isabella looked at Emily, expecting resistance, but to her surprise, Matthew's wife only nodded, albeit reluctantly. "You need help," Emily said simply, "and we can give you that." Isabella's throat constricted. For years, she had learned to face everything on her own, never expecting anything from anyone. But now, all of a sudden, she had an entire family mobilizing for her. I don't know what to say. Matthew smiled faintly. Then don't say anything. Just accept. Isabella's eyes shimmered, and for the first time since receiving her diagnosis, she felt a spark of hope. The first night in the Miller mansion was a whirlwind of emotions for Isabella. The room where Matthew had placed her was bigger than the entire small apartment she once shared with her mother. The high, ornate ceiling, the classic and elegant furniture, the silk sheets perfectly stretched over the bed. Everything seemed so distant from the reality she knew. Standing in the middle of the room, she felt as though at any moment someone would realize she didn't belong there and would throw her out. Her eyes drifted to her hands, marked by years of hard work. The scars on her fingers were reminders of the long hours spent serving tables, cleaning counters, cooking just to survive. And now, here she was, surrounded by luxury, unsure of where she fit. The house was quiet at night, but in the morning the hum of servants moving through the mansion filled the air. The staff worked efficiently, arranging fresh flowers in vases, adjusting the curtains, preparing breakfast. But every time Isabella passed by, the whispers grew louder. She could feel the eyes on her, some curious, others less discreet. Did you see? She doesn't even look sick. Is it really true? Or, they say Matthew never forgot a woman from his past. The wife accepted all this way too quickly. It's strange. Isabella pretended not to hear, but each word felt like a thorn digging into her skin. She didn't blame them. If she were in their place, she'd probably question what a woman like her was doing there. One morning, feeling suffocated by the house, she took her coffee outside into the garden. The fresh air was a relief, and the chirping of birds muffled the whispers inside. She sat on one of the stone benches beneath a large tree, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to find peace. It was then that she heard footsteps. She opened her eyes and saw Emily walking toward her, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Isabella's heart tightened. Despite Emily's kindness at the airport, part of her still expected some kind of resentment or confrontation. Without saying a word, Emily sat beside her and handed her one of the cups. "You prefer to stay out here?" Emily asked, gazing at the horizon. Isabella gave a faint smile. "It reminds me of my life before all this." They sat in silence for a while, simply sipping their coffee and listening to the wind rustling through the leaves of the trees. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "The day I saw you at the airport," she started, her voice quieter than usual, "I was scared." Isabella looked away from the landscape and focused on the woman beside her. "Scared?" Emily nodded, turning the cup in her hands. "I thought you were someone from his past, someone coming back to destroy everything we've built together." There was something in the sincerity of her voice that caught Isabella off guard. "And now?" Isabella asked. "What do you think I am?" Emily smiled faintly, though there was a touch of sadness in her expression. "Now, I understand." "Understand what?" Emily sighed. "That there was no rivalry. Matthew was always your friend, and now I know why." Isabella lowered her head, moved by the words. "I never wanted to cause any trouble," she whispered. "I know," Emily interrupted gently, "and that's why I'm here." They sat there for a while longer, neither needing to say more. They weren't friends yet, not really, but something between them had shifted. Later, Isabella realized that among the many judgmental looks she received in the mansion, there were 2 that regarded her with genuine admiration: James and Mary. The children didn't seem to see her as a stranger. On the contrary, they loved spending time with her, eager to hear stories about her time working at the airport restaurant. "Did you work there every day?" James asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Every day," Isabella replied, smiling. It was a simple place, but a lot happened there. Mary, ever enthusiastic, snuggled up next to her on the sofa. Dad said you made a very special hot chocolate. Isabella laughed. My grandmother's. She used to say that a good hot chocolate could change any bad day. James seemed to think about that for a moment and then suddenly stood up. Let's make some now. James, Mary scolded. Isabella needs to rest. Isabella, however, shook her head, amused. I'd love to make some for you. In the kitchen, the staff exchanged surprised glances when they saw Isabella mixing milk and chocolate with the children around her. Some of them still held onto their doubts, but others began to look at her with less resistance. When the cups were ready, James took a sip and his eyes widened. Wow, this is better than any hot chocolate I've ever had, Mary agreed, laughing. Now I understand why Dad didn't want to leave that night. Isabella smiled, feeling something warm grow inside her. For the first time since arriving, she didn't feel out of place. The envelope lay on the table like it carried a weight far heavier than its size suggested. Isabella stared at it with trembling hands, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. For weeks, she had clung to the hope that the treatment would work, that her stay in the Miller mansion wouldn't be in vain, that Matthew, Emily, and Jacob hadn't moved mountains for nothing. But there it was, the result, the definitive answer to the question she had been avoiding since the day she was diagnosed. Her fingers hesitated before tearing open the seal. The paper slid out smoothly, and her eyes began scanning the cold, clinical words, lines upon lines of medical terms, numbers, percentages, and then, nestled among them, the sentence she had feared the most. The treatment is not responding as expected. The ground seemed to fall from beneath her. The silence in the room was broken only by the faint sound of the paper crumpling slightly in her hand. Her body went rigid, her eyes burned, but no tears came. It felt like a blow, though she didn't quite know where it hurt most. Emily noticed first. With her sharp, attentive gaze, she saw the way Isabella froze, her shoulders slumping, her breath caught in her throat. Isabella? Emily's voice was gentle, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. She didn't answer. Emily hesitated, then moved closer, still unsure of how to approach the woman she had reluctantly accepted into her home. Since the moment Isabella arrived, there had been a silent barrier between them, something neither woman knew how to break. But in this moment, that distance didn't matter. There were no more rivalries or doubts, only two women bound by something much greater. Without a word, Emily took Isabella's hand in hers, the cold fingers trembling against her warmth. It was only then that Isabella took a deep breath, her eyes closing for a moment. The treatment isn't working, she whispered, her voice breaking soft but undeniable. Matthew, who had remained silent up to this point, took a step forward. His voice was firm, his posture commanding, as if speaking these words could somehow alter the reality. This doesn't mean we give up, he said, his tone resolute, as though simply saying it would make it true. Isabella opened her eyes and met his gaze. He looked ready to fight the inevitable, to battle the reality that seemed to be closing in on them. His jaw tightened, and the weight of the past few days seemed to hang heavier on his shoulders. Matthew, Isabella whispered. But it was Jacob who interrupted, his voice direct and rational as always, cutting through the tension. We'll get a second opinion. Now. He was already reaching for his phone, dialing numbers before anyone could respond. Jacob, Isabella started, but he raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. We're not accepting this as a final verdict, he said firmly. There are other doctors, other treatments. You're not going through this alone. The knot in Isabella's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She didn't know how to handle people caring this much, fighting for her when she had spent her entire life fighting alone. But at that moment, she only wanted one thing: to be alone. She stood up abruptly, feeling the weight of her frustration, of the crushing sense of helplessness that had accompanied her for so long. "I need—" Her words stumbled, and she took another breath before she could finish. "I need some time." No one tried to stop her as she left the room, the silence falling back into place, thick and heavy. The journey to her room felt longer than it was. Once she closed the door behind her, she leaned against it, releasing the air trapped in her lungs. Her chest felt tight, like something was suffocating her. She walked over to the small dresser and picked up a silver-framed photo. The image was slightly faded with time, but still, the features of the woman in the picture were unmistakable. Her mother's smiling face, holding a cup of tea as though trying to preserve a moment of joy. Isabella traced her fingers over the glass of the frame. "I'm so tired, Mama," she whispered, her voice cracking. The confession left her in a fragile, broken whisper, and for the first time, she allowed the tears to fall. Time seemed to pass without her noticing. She didn't know how long she stayed there, letting the sorrow, frustration, and fear wash over her. But then, a soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Isabella?" The childlike voice of Mary broke through the silence, and Isabella quickly wiped her face, trying to compose herself before responding. "Come in," she said, her voice barely audible. The door creaked open, and Mary stepped in holding a colorful piece of paper in her hands. "I made you a drawing," the little girl said shyly, holding out the artwork. Isabella took it from her gently, surprised by the gesture. The drawing depicted a small restaurant with large windows and a hand-drawn sign above the door. "This is the restaurant where you worked, right?" Mary asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Isabella felt a lump form in her throat at the sight of the drawing. The familiar scene brought back memories of her life before, of simpler times when she hadn't yet known the pain she was facing now. "Yes," Isabella whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Mary smiled. "Dad said you were happy there." Isabella blinked, stunned. "He said that?" "Uh-huh," Mary nodded eagerly. "And I think you can still be happy." The sincerity in the little girl's voice made Isabella's heart ache. Without thinking, she pulled Mary into a tight embrace. "Thank you, sweetheart," she murmured. Mary hugged her back, and for a brief moment, Isabella felt the weight of everything lighten, as if the simple act of being held could undo the pain in her chest. After a while, Mary released her and stepped back, looking up at Isabella. "Do you want to make hot chocolate now?" she asked, her face hopeful. Isabella smiled, though her eyes were still wet with tears. "I'd love that," she said softly. As Mary ran out of the room to get things ready, Isabella looked at the drawing again. The little girl had captured a place that had meant so much to her. A place that, despite all the hardships, had given her a sense of purpose. Isabella took a deep breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps her mother had been right. Perhaps there was still a way to find happiness, even in the darkest of times. And maybe, just maybe, the journey ahead wouldn't be one she had to walk alone. Matthew couldn't remember the last time he had felt such paralyzing fear. The news had hit him like a punch to the stomach, stealing his breath and rendering everything around him irrelevant. The noise of the city outside his office window, the reflection of the sun on the glass, the distant voices of the staff, none of it made sense. Isabella was losing the fight. His fists clenched, his jaw tight as his gaze remained fixed on some point in front of him. A whirlwind of memories rushed through his mind. The rainy night at the airport, the coffee she had served him without knowing she was saving his life, the note he left behind, her shout stopping him from taking the final step into the abyss. Now, she was the one who needed saving. Fear, impotence, frustration, all of it faded with a single decision. "Book the jet," Matthew's voice echoed with resolve throughout the office. The assistant, standing next to the desk, blinked in surprise. "Sir?" Matthew turned to face him, his eyes filled with determination. "Now!" The assistant didn't dare question him. He grabbed the phone and rushed out of the room, leaving Matthew alone for only a few moments before Jacob entered the office. "I just heard," Jacob said bluntly, his serious expression showing that he already knew what his brother was planning. "What are you planning?" "To find the best specialist in the world," Matthew replied, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with a tense movement. "If there's a chance to save her, I'll find it." Jacob let out a heavy sigh. "Matthew, if it's an experimental treatment, any option, I'll pay whatever it costs." Matthew insisted, cutting him off. Jacob crossed his arms, studying him for a moment before nodding. "I'll come with you." Matthew looked at him, and for the first time since he had received the news, he felt a glimmer of relief. He didn't need to ask Jacob. His brother always knew what to do. "The jet will be ready in an hour," the assistant called out as he rushed back in. Matthew grabbed his jacket, ready to leave. "Tell Emily. Let her know I won't be back until we have a solution." He and Jacob left the office. Meanwhile, in the mansion, an unexpected visitor broke the heavy, silent atmosphere that had descended on the place. Rebecca, an elderly woman with a firm posture but a warm gaze, stepped out of the car that had brought her. She wore a worn coat and carried a small bag against her chest, as if holding something precious. As soon as the front door opened, her eyes swept over the luxurious interior of the house with a mixture of awe and caution. A staff member hesitated before asking, "Do you have an appointment?" Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "Tell Isabella that Rebecca is here." The name was enough to get the message quickly to Emily. A few minutes later, Isabella appeared at the top of the stairs, frowning when she saw the visitor. But when her eyes focused on the woman, something softened in her expression. "Rebecca?" Rebecca smiled, and without waiting for anything else, Isabella hurried down the stairs and enveloped her in a tight hug. "I came as soon as I heard," Rebecca whispered, holding her firmly. "I couldn't let you face this alone." Time had not erased the bond between them. Rebecca had been the head cook at the small airport restaurant, the woman who had taught Isabella how to make the famous hot chocolate that had one day changed Matthew's life. Emily watched the scene from a distance. Later, sitting on the veranda, with the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air, Rebecca looked at Isabella with tenderness. "Do you remember what you used to tell me when we worked together?" Rebecca asked, her voice soft. Isabella smiled weakly. "That restaurant was a refuge." "It was for many," Rebecca agreed. "But above all, it was for you." Isabella turned her gaze to the horizon, absorbing her words. "I felt like I had a purpose there," she murmured. Rebecca nodded, holding her cup with both hands. "And you know what's curious? Your mother always knew that place wasn't just any restaurant." Isabella turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" Rebecca smiled, but there was something nostalgic in her expression. "Your mother saw Matthew that night, even before you met him." Isabella blinked in surprise. "How do you know?" "He came in soaked, lost, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. And your mother, well, she always had a gift for seeing beyond appearances." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. "What did she say?" Rebecca set her cup down on its saucer, looking at Isabella intently. "She said, 'My daughter can save him.'" Isabella's heart skipped a beat. "She said that?" "She did. And look what happened." Isabella leaned back in her chair, absorbing the information. Her mother had always had a unique sensitivity, a gift for sensing invisible pains. Now, understanding that she had sensed something about Matthew made everything feel even deeper. "You saved him once, Isabella," Rebecca continued, "and I believe somehow he'll do the same for you now." The wind blew gently, and for a brief moment, Isabella felt something akin to hope. Rebecca took a sip of her lukewarm coffee before setting the cup down on the dark wooden table. Her eyes, full of memories, fixed on Isabella. The silence hanging in the air on the Miller mansion's veranda was not just a reflection of the calm night, but also the weight of what was about to be revealed. "Your mother wrote a letter the night Matthew entered the restaurant," Rebecca said, her voice steady but laden with the gravity of her words. Isabella, who had been staring at the illuminated city in the distance, turned abruptly toward Rebecca. "What?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Rebecca nodded slowly, her hands folding on top of the table as she gathered her thoughts. She knew something was about to happen. She always had this strong intuition. When she saw Matthew that night, wet from the rain, lost in himself, something within her lit up. Matthew, seated beside Jacob, remained quiet, absorbing every word. "What did this letter say?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, almost as if the revelation itself had affected him too. Rebecca hesitated, carefully choosing her words before answering. "I never read it," she confessed. "But before she passed, your mother told me that within that letter were secrets about your family and your illness." Isabella's heart skipped a beat at the mention of her mother's secrets, which had always been a part of the mystery surrounding her. She had never been told anything about such a letter. "My mother never mentioned this to me," Isabella murmured, her voice laced with confusion and pain. Rebecca sighed deeply, her expression softening as she looked at Isabella. "Because she wanted to protect you. But I believe now it's time for you to know everything." Jacob, who had been silently observing everything unfold, leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Is there anything else we need to know?" Rebecca nodded, looking directly at Isabella. "The diary." The air in the room grew heavier as everyone processed the weight of those words. "What diary?" Isabella asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. "A diary written by generations of women in your family. It's hidden in the attic of the old restaurant." The memory of the restaurant, the simple wooden tables, the strong scent of coffee, and the sound of cutlery clinking against plates rushed back to Isabella. She had never ventured up to the attic. She never thought anything important could be hidden there, above the space where she had spent countless hours working. Matthew exchanged a quick glance with Jacob, who then, to everyone's surprise, leaned back in his chair and let out a deep breath. "The diary has already been found." Isabella turned to him in shock. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion. Jacob ran his hand over his face, as if contemplating how to explain. "A few months ago, I bought the building where the restaurant was located. It was a real estate investment, nothing too extraordinary. But when the renovation started, we found a compartment in the attic. Inside it, there was an old book." Isabella's pulse quickened as she absorbed the news. Could it be? Was it possible the answers to the mysteries surrounding her mother, and perhaps even herself, were in that book? "Did you read it?" she asked cautiously. Jacob shook his head. "No. When I saw your mother's name on the first pages, I knew it wasn't something that belonged to me. I kept it safe, waiting for the right moment to give it to you." The room fell into a heavy silence. Rebecca smiled softly, as if she had known all along that this moment was coming. "Then it's time," she murmured. "The fate is doing its part." Matthew, who had been processing the information with his usual sharpness, ran his fingers through his hair. "Don't you see? This isn't a coincidence." Everyone turned their gaze toward him. "I walked into that restaurant because I was lost," Matthew continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Isabella saved me without knowing who I was. But before that, your mother already knew our lives were somehow tied together." Isabella swallowed hard, feeling a deep pang in her chest. "And now, It's you who are here for me." Matthew nodded, his gaze intense. It can't just be a coincidence. Rebecca let out a quiet laugh. "Your meeting was never an accident, Matthew. It was a knot that had been tied long before either of you realized." The night stretched on, and soon Jacob brought the diary, placing it carefully in front of Isabella. The leather cover was worn and aged by time, but the engravings were still visible. With trembling hands, Isabella opened the book, her heart racing. The yellowed pages contained detailed records, medicinal recipes made from herbs, notes on symptoms, observations on patterns in the women of her family. "My mother," Isabella whispered, her eyes scanning a page written in handwriting she recognized. "She knew this could happen to me." Matthew leaned in to look closer. "What else does it say?" Isabella turned another page, and her heartbeat quickened. "There are notes about an alternative treatment, something that combines traditional knowledge with modern medicine." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Does that make sense?" Matthew, who had seen everything in the world of business and science, took the diary from Isabella with care. "We can find out," he said, as determination flooded his voice. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a new glimmer of hope ignite within her. Maybe her mother had left the answers she so desperately needed all along. Emily, who had been silent for a while, picked up the diary and flipped through the pages, studying them with keen eyes. "This changes everything," she said, her voice full of conviction. Isabella looked up at them all, her heart heavy, but also filled with a new sense of purpose. For so long she had believed she was fighting alone, but now she understood that she had a family, however unexpected, that was ready to fight with her. Matthew took her hand, his grip steady and warm. "Then let's make sure this knowledge doesn't fade away." Isabella closed the diary and smiled, though her eyes were still filled with tears. "Let's do it," she said. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking this path alone anymore. The diary lay in Isabella's trembling hands, its worn leather cover holding the weight of generations. The scent of aged paper mixed with the faint evening breeze from the veranda of the Miller mansion. The silence surrounding them felt heavier now, as if the house itself was waiting for her to turn the next page. Matthew, Jacob, and Emily watched Isabella intently as she stared at the diary, her breathing shallow as she processed what was unfolding before her. This was no longer just an old book. It was a map to everything she had never fully understood about herself, her family, and the path she was now walking. Her heart pounded as she slowly opened the book, her fingers brushing over the ancient pages. The writing was elegant but faded with time. As her eyes scanned the words, her mind struggled to absorb the vast history and significance written there. She could feel the presence of her mother in every word, a silent whisper guiding her toward the truth. Matthew, seeing the change in her expression, leaned forward. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice low, filled with both curiosity and concern. Isabella's gaze flickered to him, her breath catching in her throat as she continued reading. Her mother's handwriting seemed to come alive as the words pulled her in. They spoke of traditions passed down through the generations, ancient practices that had helped heal women in her family from illnesses that modern medicine couldn't explain. "It's all here," Isabella whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother, she knew this could happen to me. She was trying to prepare me, even though I didn't understand it at the time." Matthew's eyes softened as he reached out, placing a hand gently on hers. "What else does it say?" he pressed, trying to remain calm, but his concern for her was undeniable. Isabella hesitated before turning another page, her fingers trembling. The next set of notes appeared to be more detailed, written in her mother's careful handwriting. These entries described a specific treatment that blended herbal remedies with some principles of modern medicine, things that had been passed down through the women in Isabella's family for generations. Some of the remedies seemed almost magical, others scientifically plausible, but all of them had been carefully guarded secrets. Her heart began to race as she read on. "This treatment," she said, voice shaking, "it's something my mother believed would work for me, if only I had known." Jacob stood up from his chair, his sharp mind already processing what they were reading. "This could be what we need," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "If these treatments align with modern medical practices, we might be able to find a way to use them. We need to look into this." Isabella closed the book for a moment, trying to absorb what she had just learned. She could feel the weight of it all, the history of her family, the illness, and the long road ahead. But with the knowledge in her hands, a glimmer of hope began to form. For the first time, it felt like there was something she could do. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't alone. "Let's not waste any time," Matthew said firmly. "We'll find the right doctors who understand both the traditional and modern aspects of this. We'll make this work." Isabella looked at him, her chest tightening with the raw emotion of everything they had just uncovered. "You mean it?" she asked softly, her eyes locking with his. "You really believe this can help me?" Matthew nodded, his voice steady with conviction. "I believe it can, and I believe we're not going to give up no matter what it takes." For the first time in a long while, Isabella allowed herself to believe too. The journey ahead would be long, and it wouldn't be easy, but with the support of the people around her, maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. The diary wasn't just a key to the past, it was a key to her future. The future she could now shape with her own hands, guided by the wisdom of the generations before her. Matthew's car came to a stop in front of the unassuming building, its quiet facade heavy with memories. The airport restaurant where everything had started remained almost untouched by time. The paint on the exterior had chipped away, revealing layers of stories that were buried within. The large windows still reflected the hurried movement of travelers, yet the interior was empty, as if waiting patiently for its own resurrection. Isabella stepped out of the car slowly, her eyes scanning every detail with a mix of nostalgia and disbelief. The air carried the same familiar scent of strong coffee and distant rain, just like the night when a very different Matthew had walked through those very doors. She turned to him, searching for an explanation for this return. "Why did you bring me here?" Matthew shoved his hands into his coat pockets, taking a deep breath before answering. "Because this place is more than just a restaurant for us, Isabella." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the surroundings. "It's where my life changed, where you saved me." She looked away, absorbing his words. This place was so much more than just four walls and a few tables. It was a refuge, a starting point, a link between the past and the future. Matthew continued, "I bought this restaurant weeks ago, before I even knew you'd come back." Isabella stared at him, her surprise evident. "You bought it?" "Yes," he confirmed. "Deep down I knew I'd have to come back here one day, but now I realize the reason is much bigger than I ever imagined." He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Isabella hesitated for a moment, then stepped across the threshold. The air inside was thick with memories. Chairs were stacked up, the counter covered by a fine layer of dust, but the details remained unchanged. The same wooden shelves, the same arrangement of tables. Her footsteps echoed on the worn tile floor, and a pang of emotion tightened in her chest. Matthew walked beside her. "I want to turn this place into something greater." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned to her, his eyes glowing with determination. I want this restaurant to become a center of support, a place where people like you can receive treatment and at the same time where the wisdom of your family can be preserved and integrated with modern medicine." Isabella stood in stunned silence, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was saying. "You want to turn this into a healing space?" "Exactly." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I never thought you were the kind of man who'd think like that." Matthew smiled. "And I never thought a waitress would make me see life in a different way." Isabella's eyes shimmered, but before she could respond, a noise drew her attention. Rebecca appeared at the back door, holding a small wooden box in her hands. "I thought you'd want to see this," she said, walking toward Isabella. The box looked ancient, worn by time. Isabella carefully lifted the lid and found a stack of yellowed papers. On top was a folded letter with her name written by hand. She recognized the handwriting immediately. "It's from my mother." The room seemed to hold its breath along with her. With trembling fingers, Isabella unfolded the letter and began to read. Her mother had written it years ago, on the night Matthew had first walked into the restaurant. "My daughter, I know one day you will find this letter. I do not know when, but I know it will be at the right moment. Tonight a man walked in here, carrying a pain that he cannot explain, and I know, deep in my heart, that you can save him. But more than that, I know that one day he will come back to save you." Tears burned in Isabella's eyes. Matthew swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on her reaction. "What does it say?" She took a deep breath before answering, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother knew that one day you would come back." The silence was profound. Rebecca smiled gently, as if she had been expecting this moment. Emily and Jacob arrived minutes later, finding Isabella still holding the letter. Emily, who had once been so wary of Isabella, looked around the restaurant before turning her gaze to the scene before her. Something within her shifted in that instant. Jacob, ever the pragmatist, studied Matthew. "So, this is what you want to do?" "Yes," Matthew answered without hesitation, "but I can't do it alone." Emily, not taking her eyes off Isabella, spoke up at last. "You can count on me." Jacob sighed, crossing his arms. "If we're going to do this, we'll do it right. I know a few people who can help us make this project happen." Isabella looked at the three of them, a different kind of tightness in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was gratitude. Matthew extended his hand to her. "Well then, shall we begin?" Isabella glanced around one last time and finally smiled. "Let's." In that moment, she understood that the restaurant, which had once served only as a stopover for hasty travelers, would now become a place where people would find more than just a warm meal. They would find hope. And her story, which had begun there so many years ago, was only just starting anew. The renovated restaurant was no longer just a place for quick meals. Its walls held the secrets of the past and promises for the future. The scent of fresh coffee still filled the air, but now it mingled with something much greater: hope. Jacob, always practical and meticulous, had put all his influence into action. He wasn't a man of faith, but he believed in results, and the results began to show. Through his network of contacts, he located women spread across the country, each with stories like Isabella's. Women who, like her, carried within them an inexplicable sensitivity, a gift that allowed them to see and ease the pain of others. At the first meeting, the restaurant was filled with soft voices, some hesitant, others emotional. Isabella watched each face, feeling something stir within her. They were different in age, origin, and experiences, but they shared an invisible bond, a sharp intuition, a knowledge that transcended logic. Among them, one woman stood out: Grace. When their eyes met, Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. There was something familiar about this grey-haired woman with deep eyes. Grace approached slowly, a soft smile on her lips. "You don't know me, Isabella, but I knew your mother." The impact of those words made Isabella's heart race. "My mother?" Grace nodded. "I exchanged letters with her for years. We shared knowledge. We discussed ways to understand what we, women like us, carry. But we never managed to turn it into something concrete. Your mother believed that one day this wisdom would find its place in the world." Isabella swallowed hard. "She never told me about this." "Because it wasn't the right time," Grace replied, placing a delicate hand over hers. "But now it is." Matthew, who had been watching the conversation from a distance, realized that something monumental was unfolding. What had started as a desire to save Isabella had now turned into something much bigger, and the restaurant was becoming the heart of that transformation. The renovations went beyond the tables and counter. Doctors, therapists, and researchers became interested in what they were discovering. Modern science began to converse with the ancestral knowledge found in Isabella's mother's diary. Alternative treatments were studied alongside advanced research. The place was becoming a center of support, a refuge for those seeking healing, whether physical or emotional, but the surprises weren't over yet. One afternoon, while watching the women share their experiences, Isabella felt a small touch on her hand. It was Mary. The little girl held a steaming mug of hot chocolate and offered it to her with a shy smile. "I made this for you." Isabella took the mug, surprised. "You know how to make this?" Mary shrugged. "I don't know how to explain it, I just knew you needed it." Isabella looked at Matthew, who was watching the scene with a curious gleam in his eyes. "Did you notice this on your own?" he asked his daughter. Mary nodded. "I just felt it." Isabella's heart raced. There was no doubt. "You have the same gift," she whispered. Mary smiled innocently, not fully understanding the depth of what that meant. But Isabella knew. The cycle was not ending with her. And then the big day arrived. The restaurant was ready to be reopened, not as it once was, but as a transformed space where the past and the future converged. Isabella walked through the dining room, watching the people who filled the space. Some sought help, others came to learn. But all were there for one reason. Outside, a new garden had been created. Trees were planted in honor of the women who, for generations, had carried this gift. Isabella walked among them, feeling the soft breeze rustle the leaves. In the center of the garden, she sat at a wooden table and opened her mother's diary. She picked up a pen and wrote, "Today, the knowledge of my family finds its place in the world. We are no longer alone. Love will always guide us." Matthew, Emily, and Jacob were nearby, watching in silence. Emily, who had once seen Isabella as a threat, now saw her as a symbol of something grand. Jacob, once a skeptic, was now there, dedicating himself to ensuring that this project would be recognized by the world. And Matthew knew that all of this began because one rainy night, a waitress had stopped him from disappearing. Isabella closed the diary and smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time she felt whole, and her legacy was just beginning.